The program had my name printed on it, right there under Remarks from the Family, in the same clean font as everyone else's. And yet, when I stood up from my folding chair and walked toward the podium, Richard Jameson stepped in front of the microphone and told 400 people, in a voice that didn't shake at all, that I would not be speaking today. "This ceremony honors my son," he said, not even looking at me. "The family will speak. Sit down." I stood there in the grass in my dress uniform, my hands trembling in a way I hated, while an entire amphitheater of veterans and Gold Star families watched a grown man tell his son's widow to take her seat. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody said a word. Then a black government sedan pulled up along the gravel path behind the seating, and a man in service dress with 2 stars on his shoulders stepped out holding a small wooden case under one arm. He walked straight down the center aisle, past 400 silent faces, and stopped beside me. "Colonel Jameson," he said, loud enough for every row to hear, "I flew 11 hours to bring this young woman something that belongs to her, and I'll be damned if anyone stops her from standing up here to receive it." You left one. Backstory. My name is Simone Grayson. I never took Elliot's last name, not because I didn't want it, but because the paperwork got tangled up in a deployment cycle, and then somehow it just never got finished, and now I think about that small unfinished detail more than I probably should. I grew up the daughter of a man who never once let me feel like the army was something other people did. My father, Daniel Grayson, was a master sergeant, a combat engineer who spent 20 years building bridges and clearing routes in places I only understood the danger of once I was old enough to read what those deployments actually meant. He raised me mostly alone after my mother left when I was 4, and he did it the only way he knew how, bringing me along to every unit function, letting me fall asleep in the back of Humvees during motor pool days, teaching me to shine boots before I could tie my own shoes properly. He died when I was 16, a heart condition nobody caught in time, the kind that takes a strong man down fast and leaves you standing in a hospital hallway, wondering how someone that solid could just stop being there. I went to live with an aunt after that, finished high school in a town that never quite felt like mine, and enlisted the day I turned 18 because I didn't know how to build a life that wasn't shaped around a uniform. I met Elliot Jameson at a training exchange between our units, back when I was still a young sergeant, and he was already earning a name for himself as one of the sharpest young rangers in his battalion. He had this way of listening that made you feel like you were the only interesting person in a crowded room, and he laughed at things that weren't even that funny just because he liked watching people relax. We spent 4 months writing to each other before either of us admitted it was more than friendship, and another year after that before he finally worked up the nerve to ask me to marry him, sitting on the tailgate of his truck outside a diner that's since closed down. I knew, even then, that his family wouldn't approve of me. Elliot's father, Richard Jameson, was a retired colonel, a man who'd built a name for himself commanding a storied infantry regiment and who'd spent the years since retirement chairing a well-known Veterans Memorial Foundation, the kind of organization with its name on plaques outside 2 different state capitals. He had a plan for his son's life that involved an academy commission, a career track toward flag rank, and, somewhere down the line, a wife from a family with a name people recognized at fundraising dinners. A woman like me, enlisted, raised by a single father who never made it past Master Sergeant, wasn't part of that plan in any version Richard had drawn up in his head. Elliot used to joke that his father kept a mental spreadsheet of everything a proper Jameson was supposed to accomplish by a certain age, and that meeting me had been the first entry that refused to fit any column he'd built. I laughed along with him at the time, because it was easier than admitting how much it stung to be reduced to a variable someone else's father couldn't make sense of. Elliot told me once that his father hadn't spoken to him for 3 weeks after he found out about the engagement. "He'll come around," Elliot said, the way he said most things that worried him. Like saying it out loud made it more likely to be true. We got married at the courthouse near his duty station, because waiting for a wedding his family might attend felt like waiting for something that was never coming. His mother, Louise, came. His father did not. His younger sister, Mara, sent flowers with no card attached, which felt like a message all on its own. We built a good life anyway, moving between duty stations, adopting a rescue dog we never should have named Turnip, learning each other's habits the way people do when distance keeps interrupting them. Elliot deployed twice during our marriage. Each homecoming felt like getting away with something, like we'd beaten odds neither of us said out loud we were counting. 10 months ago, his battalion deployed again, this time on a rotation that put him in a training partnership overseas, working alongside Allied forces in terrain that turned out to be more dangerous than anyone briefed him for. 2 months into that deployment, a vehicle he was riding in struck an improvised device during a routine movement between outposts. He was 31 years old. I was standing in our kitchen when the notification team arrived, Turnip barking at the door before I even heard the knock, and some part of me already knew, the way you know a storm is close before the sky actually changes color. Elliot's commanding officer would later tell me that in the seconds after the blast, Elliot had pulled 2 of his soldiers clear of the wreckage before the second vehicle in the convoy could reach them, absorbing most of the force of what happened next himself. I called Richard Jameson that same evening. He answered, listened for a long moment, and then said, quietly, I always told him the army would take everything from him eventually. No question about how it happened. No mention of missing his son. Just a verdict he'd apparently been keeping ready for years, waiting for the day it would finally apply. That should have told me everything I needed to know about the ceremony that was coming. I just didn't want to believe a grieving father could still find room in himself for that kind of coldness toward the one person who'd loved his son as much as he had. There's a photograph I keep in a drawer I don't open very often. One Elliot took the first Thanksgiving we spent together as a married couple. We'd driven 6 hours to his parents' house, hoping the holiday might soften something between us, and I remember standing in the doorway of that house, feeling like a guest who'd wandered in from the wrong party. Richard shook my hand like I was a stranger at a business function. He asked Elliot about the academy classmates he still kept in touch with, about a promotion board coming up, about everything except the woman standing beside his son. Louise tried, in her quiet way, to fill the gaps her husband left, asking about my family, about my father, listening in a way that felt genuine even as she kept glancing toward Richard, like she was checking whether it was safe to keep asking. We left that evening before dessert. Elliot apologized the whole drive home, the way he always did. Like his father's coldness was something he personally owed me an explanation for. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it, but some quiet part of me had already started keeping score, counting up all the ways a family could make you feel like a visitor in your own marriage. What made it harder to accept was that Richard wasn't a cruel man in every direction. He gave generously to the foundation he chaired. He mentored young officers who'd lost their own fathers to deployments gone wrong. He could stand in front of a room of grieving families and say the right words, without stumbling once, the kind that made news cameras want to follow him for a quote. He simply couldn't find that same generosity for me, and I spent years trying to understand why, before I finally accepted that some people build their sense of family around a blueprint, and anyone who doesn't match the drawing gets treated like an intruder no matter how long they stay. Elliot never stopped trying to close that gap. He called his father every month, even during deployments when the connection dropped more than it held, just so Richard would have no excuse to say his son had gone silent on him. He sent photographs from every promotion ceremony, hoping one of them might finally earn a response warmer than the last. It never really came, not in the way Elliot hoped for, and I used to lie awake some nights wondering what it cost a person to keep reaching toward someone who never quite reached back. I think about the tailgate proposal often, more than any other memory from those years. We'd just come off a training exercise that ran longer than anyone planned, both of us covered in dust, exhausted in the particular way that makes everything feel funnier than it should. He didn't have a ring yet. He just turned to me, out of nowhere, and said he'd spent the whole exercise thinking about how much he didn't want to go another year writing letters home to someone who wasn't legally his. I laughed at him, told him that wasn't the romantic line he probably imagined saying, and he laughed too, admitting he'd rehearsed something better and forgotten every word of it the moment he opened his mouth. That's the version of Elliot most people never got to see. The one underneath the rank and the reputation his father wanted so badly to shape into something else. He was funny in a way that snuck up on you, patient with people who didn't deserve it, the kind of man who remembered the names of everyone's kids at a unit picnic and asked about them the next time he saw them. Richard wanted a son who'd climb a career ladder built from someone else's blueprint. What he actually raised, without ever quite noticing it, was a man who'd give away nearly everything he had if it meant someone else got to keep theirs. AC2, the incident. The Fallen Heroes Memorial Foundation, the organization Richard chaired, hosted its remembrance ceremony every year on a stretch of lawn behind the county courthouse. An event that drew veterans from 3 counties, local news cameras, and a folding stage decorated with flags for every branch of service. Because Elliot had died within the year, the foundation board decided to dedicate part of the ceremony to him, which meant Richard, as chairman, controlled almost everything about how that dedication would look. I received the program a week ahead of time in the mail, my name printed clearly under a section labeled Remarks from the Family, scheduled right after the color guard presentation. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when I saw it. Some small relief that maybe, in the middle of everything, Richard had decided to let this be about honoring his son, rather than continuing whatever argument he'd been having with me since before the wedding. I should have known better. The morning of the ceremony, I arrived early with Louise, who'd grown quieter and more careful around her husband ever since the funeral, like she was constantly measuring the distance between what she wanted to say and what she was allowed to. Mara arrived shortly after, giving me a hug that lasted a beat longer than any greeting she'd offered me before, and I remember thinking that maybe something between us was finally starting to soften. The lawn behind the courthouse filled up faster than I expected that morning, families arriving in small clusters carrying folding chairs and thermoses of coffee, veterans in ball caps marking their old units settling into rows near the front. Somewhere in that crowd, though I didn't know it yet, sat 2 young men who'd flown in without telling anyone why, and a handful of board members who'd spent years watching Richard run this event the way he wanted, never quite noticing how much of it depended on people simply going along with him, rather than questioning what he decided. The ceremony opened with a chaplain's invocation, then the color guard, then a series of remarks from local officials that ran long enough for the crowd to start shifting in their seats. When the MC finally called for the family remarks, I stood, smoothed my uniform, and started walking toward the small set of stairs leading up to the podium. Richard reached the microphone before I did. He told the crowd that he wanted to say a few words about his son first, and the MC, caught off guard, simply nodded and stepped aside. What followed wasn't a few words. It was 15 minutes about Elliot's childhood, his own service, his hopes for what his son might have become, delivered in the practiced cadence of a man used to commanding a room. Not once did he mention me. Not once did he say the word wife. When he finally paused, I stood again, thinking this was my moment, and started toward the steps a second time. That's when Richard turned, looked directly at me for the first time all morning, and said the words that would follow me for a long time after that day. This ceremony honors my son. The family will speak. Sit down. I felt every eye in that amphitheater land on me at once. I felt my own pulse pound somewhere behind my ears, loud enough that I almost didn't hear the murmur that rippled through the crowd. A mixture of confusion and discomfort nobody seemed willing to act on. I thought about Elliot, about how mortified he would have been watching his father do this. And I thought about my own father, about the 20 years he spent teaching me that composure was armor you could wear, even when nothing else protected you. So I sat down, I folded my hands in my lap the way I'd learned to do a long time ago, and I stared straight ahead, refusing to give Richard Jameson the satisfaction of watching me come apart in front of strangers. What I didn't know, sitting there in that folding chair, was that a car was already making its way up the gravel road behind the seating, carrying a man who'd spent the last 11 hours flying across an ocean because he'd read something in a casualty report 2 weeks earlier that he wasn't willing to let stand without correction. I want to be honest about the minutes right after Richard told me to sit down, because there's a version of telling this story where I skip past how much that moment actually cost me. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them flat against my thighs to keep anyone from noticing. I stared at a spot somewhere past the stage, past the flag snapping gently in the breeze, and I tried to remember every trick my father ever taught me about holding a straight face through something unbearable. He used to tell me that composure isn't the absence of feeling something. It's deciding not to hand that feeling to the person who's trying to take it from you. Louise reached over at one point and squeezed my hand, so briefly I almost thought I'd imagined it, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the courage in front of her husband. Mara sat rigid beside her, jaw tight, staring at the back of her father's head with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Something between disbelief and a slow-building anger she clearly hadn't decided what to do with yet. I thought, in that stretch of silence, about calling the whole thing off in my head, about simply standing up and walking to my car without another word, letting Richard have his ceremony the way he wanted it, uninterrupted and unquestioned. Some part of me had spent years choosing that option whenever he made me feel small, retreating rather than making a scene, because Elliot's relationship with his father always felt fragile enough that I didn't want to be the reason it broke completely. But Elliot wasn't here anymore to protect from that particular fallout, and something about that fact made me stay in my seat instead of walking away, even if I didn't yet know what staying would lead to. I thought about the two soldiers Elliot had pulled out of that burning vehicle, men I'd never met, whose names I only knew from a report I'd read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, the same way my father's last letter had gone soft in my Bible years earlier. I wondered if either of them were somewhere in that crowd, watching a stranger's father dismiss the woman their friend had died coming home to. I hoped, if they were, that they at least understood I wasn't the kind of woman who'd simply disappear because someone told her to. ACT-3, The Reckoning. The black sedan pulled up along the edge of the amphitheater, just as the MC was fumbling through an attempt to move the program along. A man in service dress stepped out, 2 stars gleaming on each shoulder, a small wooden case tucked under one arm, and walked straight down the center aisle without waiting for anyone to announce him. I recognized him before he reached me. Brigadier General Theodore Larson had commanded Elliot's brigade during the deployment, a man Elliot had mentioned in letters more than once, always with the kind of respect soldiers reserve for officers who actually earn it rather than simply outrank everyone around them. He stopped beside my chair and looked directly at Richard Jameson, still standing near the podium with the stunned expression of a man unused to being interrupted. "Colonel Jameson," General Larson said, his voice carrying easily across the amphitheater without needing to be raised. "I flew 11 hours to bring this young woman something that belongs to her, and I'll be damned if anyone stops her from standing up here to receive it." Richard tried to recover some footing, insisting this was a family matter, that decisions about who represented Elliot's legacy belonged to the people who'd raised him, not to a woman who'd only known him a handful of years. General Larson didn't raise his voice, but something in his tone sharpened into the kind of authority that fills a room without effort. "Staff Sergeant Jameson's wife is his legally designated next of kin," he said. "Army regulation on posthumous awards places the spouse first in the order of precedence for a reason, and that reason doesn't bend because a ceremony has your name on the program as chairman." He opened the wooden case as he spoke, revealing a bronze star with a small bronze V device pinned beside the ribbon. "This is Staff Sergeant Jameson's final award, approved after his death for pulling 2 soldiers clear of a burning vehicle before the second explosion. I intended to present this to his wife today, in front of everyone who came to remember him. I still intend to see that through, right here, right now." Richard's expression shifted then, something between disbelief and the beginning of an argument he clearly hadn't rehearsed for this scenario. He said something about how a foundation he built with his own hands should be allowed to run its own ceremonies without outside interference, and General Larson simply let him finish before answering. "You built a foundation to honor soldiers who didn't hesitate when it counted," he said. "Your son didn't hesitate either, not once. In 2 deployments under my command. The least this foundation owes him is a ceremony that doesn't hesitate to tell the truth about who stood beside him." The crowd had gone still enough that his words carried to the very back row without any need for a microphone. He turned to me and extended his hand, and I stood on legs that didn't feel entirely steady, walking the same path toward the podium I'd been blocked from twice already. The crowd had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that comes from 400 people realizing, all at once, that they'd watched something happen they should have stopped and hadn't. General Larson placed the metal case in my hands himself, then turned to address the crowd. "Staff Sergeant Elliot Jameson served under my command for the better part of 2 years, he said. "I've read the after-action report from the day he died more times than I can count, and every version of it says the same thing. 3 of my soldiers are alive today because he didn't hesitate." His wife stood beside him through 2 deployments, packed his gear, waited by a phone that didn't always ring on schedule, and buried him with more grace than most people could manage. She has earned the right to speak here today, and I'd ask everyone in this crowd to give her the room to do it. Richard opened his mouth to object again, but a woman near the front row, a member of the Foundation's own board I recognized from earlier meetings I'd attended with Elliot years before, stood and quietly reminded him, loud enough for those nearby to hear, that the Foundation's own charter required recognition of a fallen service member's legal next of kin during any dedication ceremony, and that excluding a spouse without board approval violated the very bylaws he'd helped write. Richard's face went rigid, and for the first time since I'd known him, he had nothing ready to say back. I walked to the podium, the bronze star heavy and cool in my hands, and for a moment, I didn't know where to start. Then I thought about my father, about the version of composure he'd taught me, and I thought about Elliot, about how he used to say the bravest thing a person could do was simply refuse to disappear when someone wanted them to. So I spoke. I talked about the man Elliot had been before any uniform, before any rank. The version of him that used to leave terrible cartoon drawings in the margins of his letters just to make me laugh on a hard day. I talked about the two soldiers he pulled clear of that wreckage, both of whom, I later learned, were sitting somewhere in that crowd, having traveled across the country because they needed to see this ceremony happen the right way. By the time I finished, the amphitheater was quiet in a different way than it had been 30 minutes earlier. Louise was crying openly in her seat. Mara stood, applauding before anyone else did, and within seconds, the whole crowd rose with her. Two men near the back of the crowd stood as well, both of them younger than I expected, both wearing expressions I recognized from every homecoming I'd ever attended, the particular look of soldiers carrying something heavier than gratitude. After the ceremony wound down, they found their way over to me, introducing themselves as the two men Elliot had pulled from the wreckage that day. One of them, barely out of his teens by the look of him, couldn't get more than a few words out before his voice broke entirely, and I found myself holding his hand the way I imagine Elliot might have, steady and unhurried, letting him take whatever time he needed to say what he'd traveled there to say. General Larson stayed close by throughout all of it, not inserting himself into the moment, but making sure, with his presence alone, that nobody else would try to interrupt it either. Before he left, he pulled me aside and told me something I hadn't expected. He said he'd read Elliot's personnel file more times than any officer probably should, searching for something that might explain how a young ranger built the kind of instinct that makes a person choose someone else's safety over his own without hesitation. He said the file never explained it fully, that some things about a person's character simply exist without a clean paper trail behind them, but that meeting me that day had told him more about where that instinct came from than any record ever could. Richard didn't approach me again that afternoon. I watched him from a distance, standing near his car with a stiffness in his shoulders I hadn't seen before, the posture of a man used to controlling every room he walked into, suddenly finding himself unable to control this one. Louise walked over to him at one point, said something I couldn't hear, and he didn't respond, just stared out across the emptying lawn like he was trying to work out how the day had slipped so completely out of his hands. ACT 4. After 3 weeks after the ceremony, the Fallen Heroes Memorial Foundation's board convened for what was supposed to be a routine quarterly meeting and instead became something else entirely. The board member who'd spoken up that day brought a formal complaint regarding Richard's handling of the program, and after a closed-door session that ran nearly 4 hours, the board voted to remove him as chairman, citing repeated violations of the Foundation's own bylaws around family recognition. He remains a member of the organization he built, but he no longer controls a single decision about how it honors the families it claims to serve. Louise called me 2 days after that vote, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, and told me she'd spent 30 years letting her husband decide what kind of family they were allowed to be, and that watching me stand at that podium had reminded her there was still time to decide something different for herself. We talk most weeks now. She keeps a framed photograph of Elliot and me on her mantle, right beside one of him as a boy, and she told me once that having both pictures side by side finally felt like the truth rather than a compromise. Mara and I have grown close in a way I never expected. She's become the kind of sister I always wished I'd had. Someone who calls just to check in, who drove 4 hours last month simply to sit with me on a Sunday afternoon because she said grief shouldn't only get visitors on anniversaries. The two soldiers Elliot pulled from that burning vehicle both reached out to me in the weeks that followed. One of them, a young corporal barely out of his teens when it happened, told me he named his newborn daughter Ellie, after the man who made sure he lived long enough to have one. I keep the photograph he sent me tucked into the same drawer where I keep Elliot's letters, the ones with Turnip's terrible cartoon likeness scratched into the margins, still slightly smudged where his hand moved faster than his pen could manage. General Larson and I still talk on occasion. He called on what would have been Elliot's next birthday, not because protocol required it, but because he said a good commander doesn't stop looking after the families his soldiers left behind just because a deployment ends. He told me the Foundation's new board reached out to him about establishing an annual scholarship in Elliot's name for children of fallen Rangers and asked if I'd be willing to help choose the first recipient. I said yes before he finished the question. The board also asked me, a few weeks later, to join as an honorary member myself, a gesture I didn't expect and almost declined out of some lingering instinct to avoid anything connected to that stage. But Louise talked me into attending the first meeting, sitting beside me the whole time, and I found something quietly healing about being in that room not as someone tolerated, but as someone whose seat nobody questioned. The new chairman, a retired command sergeant major who'd served 2 decades before Richard ever took the position, opened the meeting by reading Elliot's name aloud, along with every fallen service member the Foundation existed to honor. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was sitting inside an organization that actually understood what it claimed to stand for. Richard reached out to me once, about 2 months after the vote that removed him from his chairmanship. He didn't call. He sent a letter, handwritten, which surprised me almost as much as anything else that year, given how little I'd ever seen him put down on paper for anyone. It wasn't an apology, not fully. It read more like a man trying to explain himself to someone he still wasn't sure deserved the explanation, describing a version of fatherhood built entirely around control, around a fear that if he let go of any single expectation for his son's life, the whole structure he'd built would come apart. He wrote that watching me stand at that podium had been the first time he'd seen, clearly, that the structure had already come apart years earlier, the day Elliot chose to love someone his father hadn't picked out for him, and that none of Richard's plans had ever mattered as much as he believed they did. I haven't responded yet. I keep the letter in the same drawer as Elliot's cartoons and my father's last words to me, not because I've forgiven everything it represents, but because some part of me understands now that even the people who hurt us carry their own version of grief, twisted into shapes that don't always look like grief at all. The corporal who named his daughter after Elliot sends me photographs every few months, updates on a little girl growing up under a name chosen because a stranger decided her life mattered enough to risk his own. I've started keeping a small album just for those photographs, tucked next to the folded flag on our mantel, a quiet record of everyone still walking around in the world, because Elliot didn't hesitate when it mattered. The Bronze Star sits in a display case on our mantel now, beside a folded flag and a photograph of Elliot laughing at something just out of frame, taken a few weeks before he deployed for the last time. Some mornings I still set out 2 coffee cups before I remember there's only one person drinking from them. Turnip still waits by the door most evenings around the time Elliot used to come home, and I've given up trying to explain to a dog why that stopped happening. But I've started noticing something else, too. The composure my father spent 20 years teaching me, the same steadiness that got me through a funeral, through a ceremony where a man tried to erase me in front of hundreds of strangers, has started making room for something warmer sitting right alongside it. Gratitude, mostly. For a general who flew across an ocean rather than let an injustice stand. For a mother-in-law finally finding her own voice. For a sister who decided grief was reason enough to show up rather than stay away. For a husband who never once let fear decide what he was willing to do for the people counting on him. I drove past the amphitheater a few weeks ago, on my way somewhere else entirely, and found myself pulling into the lot without really deciding to. The lawn was empty, the folding chairs long since packed away, nothing left to mark what happened there except a small plaque near the entrance that the new board had installed, listing the names of local fallen service members honored at past ceremonies. Elliot's name sat near the bottom, and beside it, in smaller print than I expected, mine. Not as an afterthought, as a fact the Foundation had finally gotten right. I sat there for a while, longer than I meant to, thinking about how strange it is that a single afternoon can hold both the worst humiliation of your life and the moment everything after it started to change. Richard tried to erase me from a program with his own name printed at the top of it, and instead, he handed me a story I never would have had otherwise, one where a stranger in service dress flew across the world just to make sure the truth got said out loud. I don't know if Elliot ever imagined a day like that one. I like to think, somewhere, he'd have found it funny, the way he found most hard things funny once they were finally behind him. Some evenings, when the house feels a little too quiet and Turnip has already given up waiting by the door, I take the bronze star out of its case just to hold it for a minute. It isn't the medal itself that matters most to me, though I understand why it matters to the Army, why regulations exist to make sure it lands in the right hands. What matters is what it represents, that somewhere, in the worst moment of his life, Elliot chose two strangers over his own safety without a second of hesitation, and that a commander who barely knew me beyond a name in a personnel file cared enough to make sure that choice never got buried under someone else's need for control. I think that's the part of this story I want people to remember most, more than the podium, more than Richard's face when he realized the day had slipped out of his hands. Somewhere, there is always someone willing to tell the truth out loud, even when it costs them something to say it. I got lucky enough to have that person show up wearing 2 stars on his shoulder. Not everyone does, but I like to believe that kind of person exists everywhere, in every unit, in every family, waiting for the moment someone needs them to stand up and simply refuse to let an injustice pass unanswered. If this story stayed with you, tell me one word in the comments, the word that describes what it actually takes to stand up for the people we've lost when someone else tries to decide their story for us. Simone never asked anyone to fight her battle. She'd already learned, long before that ceremony, how to hold her ground quietly. But every so often, the people who loved someone the way we did show up not because we need saving, but because the truth deserves a witness willing to say it out loud, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. And if this story reminded you that the people who truly belong to us are the ones who show up, not the ones who share our name, subscribe. Because tomorrow, I am telling you about the they erased my husband from their family. Then his unit exposed the truth they buried. I'll see you there.